Hello and welcome to WION Live broadcast from Washington, DC. I'm Nick Harper, and in this bulletin we'll get you a roundup of the stories developing around the world. First up, the headlines. Host Boris Johnson welcomes over 120 world leaders at the last Best Hope Climate Summit. US President Joe Biden, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen arrive at COP26. PM Modi warmly greets UN Chief Antonio Guterres and UK PM Boris Johnson at the start of the COP26 summit in Glasgow. PM Modi to present India's climate plan along with launching 2 initiatives.
Well, this is very, very urgent for not just for our country, for the whole world. And if I had to give a comparison, I'd say it was a 1 minute to midnight moment.
As the COP26 summit kicks off, UK Prime Minister reminds the world about the urgency on climate change. He says the time to act is now. After skipping the G20 summit, Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be attending the COP26 summit as well. A Kremlin spokesperson said Putin won't participate as video conferencing is not envisaged at the Glasgow meet. Fishing rights tensions set to escalate further as Britain tells France that it must back down within 48 hours, following which it will impose targeted measures, including checks on trucks coming in from France. And Iran rejects concerns of Western nations over the nuclear compliance. The Iranian Foreign Ministry says positions of Western nations are incompatible with reality and will not bring constructive results. The COP26, which is the 26th edition of the United Nations Climate Change Conference of Parties, is underway in Glasgow. More than 120 world leaders have arrived for the historic climate talks. The host, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres warmly welcomed all global leaders. US President Joe Biden, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Australian PM Scott Morrison, they've all arrived for the summit. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was greeted by Johnson and Guterres. Even before reaching Glasgow, PM Modi had set the tone for the COP26 with a hard-hitting message during the G20 session on climate and environment. The COP26 is being touted as the last chance to keep the 2015 goal to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In his opening remarks, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson urged world leaders not to run down the doomsday clock. He added the longer we fail to act, the worse it gets, and the higher the price when we are eventually forced by catastrophe to act. Prime Minister also warned world leaders by saying if we fail, the future generations would not forgive us, and that they would be right to hold contempt for the world leaders if they fail to reach a deal.
Globally famous fictional device, desperate. 2 degrees more and we jeopardize the food supply for hundreds of millions of people as crops wither, locusts swarm. 3 degrees. And you can add more wildfires and cyclones, twice as many, 5 times as many droughts, and 36 times as many heat waves. 4 degrees, and we say goodbye to whole cities. Miami, Alexandria, Shanghai, all lost beneath the waves. Humanity has long since run down the clock on climate change. It's 1 minute to midnight on that doomsday clock, and we need to act now. If we don't get serious about climate change today, it will be too late for our children to do so tomorrow. We in the developed world must recognize the special responsibility we have to help everybody else to do it. Because it was here in Glasgow 250 years ago that James Watt came up with a machine that was powered by steam, that was produced by burning coal. And yes, my friends, we've brought you to the very place where the doomsday machine began to tick.
COP26 participants are going to review the progress they've made on the 2015 Paris climate deal. Signatories had agreed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. They hope to achieve this by limiting the use of fossil fuels. Nations had pledged to keep their greenhouse emissions in check. The goal was to keep the global temperature rise within 1.5 degrees Celsius. Several of the rich nations had pledged to aid poorer nations in their fight against climate change. They vowed to set up a fund of $100 billion. Well, WION correspondent Laura Macon-Isherwood sent us this report a little earlier from Glasgow. Take a look.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that he wants to tackle coal, cars, cash and trees. So planting those, of course, and offering more cash to other nations too, but cutting the others. So cutting the fossil fuels that cars use and vehicles as well to get around, instead moving to sort of electric or hybrid versions that way, and also cutting carbon emissions. We've had warnings from meteorologists across the world basically saying that levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are getting to a point where they're at their limits, really, and the warming that's taking place around the globe is accelerating. If that continues, then it will set off a string of feedback cycles across the world, where ice caps continue to melt, and then more heat is absorbed into the sea because it is seen as a darker colour, of course, on the Earth's surface, and that in turn will warm that again and continue this warming cycle continuously. The impacts of that around the globe are going to be huge. More desertification, more flooding. We've seen a lot of those events recently, and of course perhaps displacing many populations and affecting lives and livelihoods. So here at this summit it is essential, Boris Johnson says, to try to tackle that. He's also looking to push on the finance angle, getting developed nations to pledge to hit a $100 billion mark of offering finance to the global south every year. That's a target that's been missed every year since 2013. So the pressure really is on here to bring nations together so that they can work together on tackling climate change.
Next today, world leaders at the G20 meet in Rome discussed action to ease mounting supply chain issues and to make it more resilient in the face of any future health crisis. Supply chain problems have emerged as the global economy pulls out of a panic-induced recession that threatens to slow recovery. The US has vowed financial aid to Mexico and Central American countries to resolve logistical backups. World leaders emphasise the need for security, especially in technology supply chains, and fair and sustainable labour conditions.
Wrapping up what was the first in-person G20 since the pandemic began, U.S. President Joe Biden in Rome on Sunday told reporters he and 16 other world leaders discussed action to make supply chains more resilient in the face of any future health crises, as well as climate change and even planned attacks. Supply chain problems have emerged as the global economy has pulled out of a pandemic-induced recession and threatened to slow recovery. They have already stoked inflation.
We have to take action now, together with our partners in the private sector, to reduce the backlogs that we're facing. And then we have to prevent this from happening again in the future.
The G20 meeting also drew criticism for not taking enough political action to make good on climate promises. Biden blasted China and Russia for the inaction on climate change.
With regard to the disappointment relates to the fact that Russia and including not only Russia but China basically didn't show up in terms of any commitments to deal with climate change.
Separately, Biden said Britain, Germany, and France came together on a shared belief that diplomacy is the, quote, best way to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and discussed ways to get back to the negotiating table. Biden also said that the United States will respond to actions Iran has taken against Washington's interests, including drone strikes. Biden will now head to the UN COP26 climate talks in Glasgow, Scotland, and join other world leaders to discuss ways to address some of the world's most pressing environmental issues.
At a time when tensions are escalating between NATO allies, the US and Turkey, US President Joe Biden and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met to discuss the waning relationship on the sidelines of the G20 summit. Reports indicate that the two leaders discussed a wide range of issues, including Turkey's removal from the US-led F-35 stealth fighter jet program. Earlier, the US had sanctioned Turkey for buying the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. The US administration stopped the sale of 100 F-35 jets to Turkey over its deal with Russia. The F-35 jets are considered to be the most advanced US airplane. The meeting also included talks on regional issues such as Syria and Libya. President Biden told Turkish President Erdogan his request for the F-16 fighter jets had to go through a process in the United States. Erdogan, however, said that Biden was positive towards the jet sale.
F-35'ten kaynaklanan bildiğiniz gibi bizim 1 milyar 400 milyon dolar bir ödememiz vardı ve bu ödemeden hareketle biz bu süreci nasıl iyi bir konuma taşırız? Bunun üzerinde durduk. Bunun üzerinde de daha çok F-16'lar gündeme geldi. F-16'ların elimizdekilerin modernizasyonu veyahut da yeni F-16'lar verilmesi konusu gündemimize geldi.
US President Joe Biden also warned the Turkish president on what the US calls impulsive actions. Earlier, Erdogan removed protection for 10 envoys, including the US envoy to Turkey, later withdrawing the threat to expel them. Most of Europe and NATO is disappointed with Erdogan's foreign policy and having close defence ties with Russia. The alleged incursion of Turkey into the Greek and Cyprus waters also angered NATO allies. Erdogan's administration has allegedly been hostile towards Mediterranean countries such as Greece and Cyprus. Turkey has also deployed troops on the Syrian border to launch attacks against the US-backed Kurdish forces. The move irked the international community. Turkey also withdrew the troops from Libya, a long-standing request from Russia. Next today, US President Joe Biden has once again slammed Donald Trump. Biden says the US continues to suffer due to Trump's decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. Former US President Donald Trump had unilaterally decided to abandon the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action back in 2018. Since then, multiple rounds of talks, threats and sanctions have failed to break the deadlock with Tehran. Iran also retaliated by violating terms of the agreement, and Biden says that that is all down to Trump.
I think we're continuing to suffer from the very bad judgments that President Trump made in pulling out of the JCPOA. And so that's one issue, and that issue is going to depend on whether and how that gets resolved is going to depend on their action and the willingness of our friends who were part of the original agreement to stick with us and make sure there's a price to pay economically for them to fail to come back. With regard to the issue of how we're going to respond to actions taken by them against interests of the United States, whether they're drone strikes or anything else, is we're going to respond, and we're going to continue to respond.
Tehran says that it will return to the nuclear agreement, but only if other world powers, including the United States, also comply with the terms of the 2015 agreement. This means lifting sanctions imposed by Washington. While negotiations continue, Tehran has shown that it has the capacity to enrich uranium up to 60%, dangerously exceeding the limits set out by the International Atomic Agency. Tehran also announced it has a 120 kilogram stockpile of 20% enriched uranium. Meanwhile, the heads of global powers, including Biden, Macron, Merkel and Boris Johnson, met on the sidelines of the G20 to discuss the Iran nuclear deal standoff. The leaders urged Iran to resume compliance with the 2015 nuclear deal in order to avoid a dangerous escalation. Biden, however, reiterated that while Washington wants to return to the nuclear deal, it will depend on Tehran's actions. Meanwhile, on Friday, the United States issued a fresh round of Iran-related sanctions tied to an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps drone program that it said threatened regional stability. The 2015 accord helps curtail Iran's nuclear work and prevents Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. In exchange, Iran has been promised a lifting of global sanctions. Tehran says if Biden is actually serious about rejoining the 2015 deal with world powers, then he should simply issue an executive order and bypass the stalled negotiations. The world powers, however, remain cautious. Outgoing German Chancellor Angela Merkel claimed Iran's uranium enrichment is deeply concerning.
We are counting on a return of Iran to the negotiating table, but the clock is ticking. Uranium enrichment is occurring in Iran and this deeply concerns us. That's why it was time to discuss what can be done so that Iran does not get nuclear weapons.
Meanwhile, Iran has announced that it will resume nuclear negotiations by the end of November. The previous round of talks in Vienna had broken off in June due to the Iranian presidential elections. Next, deepening an already fraught diplomatic crisis. French President Emmanuel Macron accused the Australian PM of outrightly lying over a cancelled submarine deal. Macron indicated more was needed to be done to rebuild trust between the two allies. Macron and Morrison were in Rome for the G20 summit, the first time that they'd met since Australia scrapped a multi-billion-dollar submarine deal with France as part of a new security alliance with the United States and Britain that was announced in September.
I do respect sovereign choices.
French President Emmanuel Macron said Australia's leader, Scott Morrison, lied to him over a cancelled submarine contract. It's the latest shot fired between the two countries, as both leaders were in Rome for the G20, meeting for the first time since Australia ditched the multi-billion-dollar deal with France. Macron spoke to a group of Australian reporters on the sidelines of the summit.
I have a lot of respect for your country. I have a lot of respect and a lot of friendship for your people. I just say when we have respect, you have to be true and you have to behave in line and consistently with this value.
Do you think he lied to you?
I don't think. I know.
Australia formed a new security alliance with Britain and the US known as AUKUS in September. They then announced a new order for nuclear-powered submarines. Macron says AUKUS caught them off guard, and later France recalled its ambassadors from Washington and Canberra. Speaking at the conference, Morrison then fired back at Macron. He said he had explained to Macron that the conventional submarines would no longer meet Australia's needs, and that they were already rebuilding their ties. On Friday, US President Joe Biden said he had thought France had been informed of the contract cancellation before the AUKUS pact was announced, but that the handling of the new agreement had been clumsy.
Australia has started taking steps to gradually lift COVID-19 restrictions again. International borders have reopened for fully vaccinated Australian citizens and permanent residents, with no mandatory quarantine on arrival in Sydney and Melbourne. Overseas tourists and international students, though, still face restrictions upon entering Australia. Fully vaccinated travellers from New Zealand with a negative COVID test result can now enter Australia, and the next set of foreign travellers who will be allowed to enter Australia will be those from Singapore. In the latest, Australia has recognised India's Covaxin for the purpose of travel to the country.
Nearly 600 days after a pandemic closure began, Australia reopened its international border. As passengers began to trickle into the arrivals terminal at the Sydney airport, emotional scenes unfolded as loved ones reunited.
It felt fantastic to see the Australian shoreline again. I have been here for like 3 years and haven't seen my family for 2 years, so yeah.
Absolutely incredible to be home. It's been a very long time, so sorry, a little bit emotional, but it's great to be home.
On March 20th, 2020, Australia introduced some of the world's toughest restrictions to contain the spread of coronavirus. Almost all travel to the island continent halted. For the last 19 months, Australians have been banned from travelling overseas without permission. Families were split across continents. Tens of thousands of nationals were stranded overseas.
Well, I haven't seen my family for 4 years. We've been trying to get in for a year and a half, and my dad actually, he was terminally ill, but we were trying to come in as soon as possible, but he passed away a week ago. I'm sorry. So we were finally able to get a flight because the quarantine and everything, the restrictions got loosened, so we were able to come in.
The ones who did get permission to enter were forced to spend thousands of dollars and agree to quarantine for 14 days in a hotel room. These conditions have now been dropped for Sydney and Melbourne.
Much better. I feel confident to come back because if there was a quarantine factor, that was just stopping me to go. Like, I come back 14 days total quarantine. I think that was a stopping factor for me. But now I'm pretty excited. There's no quarantine. Yeah, that's fine. I can freely travel and come back.
Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said it was a big day for Australia. He added that the country was now ready for takeoff. Travel, however, is expected to resume slowly. Over 1 million foreign residents remain stuck in Australia as relaxed rules apply mainly to citizens and permanent residents. The 14-day mandatory hotel quarantine rule will also stay in place for states with lower vaccination rates. Meanwhile, Australia has also recognized India's Covaxin for the purpose of travel to the country.
Thank you.
This recognition is for travellers aged 12 and over who have been vaccinated with Covaxin. It would have a significant impact on the return of international students and travel of skilled and unskilled workers to Australia. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Well, that's all we have time for on today's WION Live broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Nick Harper, and for more global news and updates, stay tuned to WION World is One.
There are many other... this is right, Arab.